Well, hello everyone. I think it has been long overdue for both an appearance and a continuation of the series I started a few years ago on the project. Over those years, I have been surprised by the number of comments and requests about servicing these beasts of the past, but I think it is safe to say not everyone has a jukebox in their family. Now, for those who do happen to have the privilege to own and or work on one, this is part of a series of videos put together as a guide rather than a how-to per se, as although the concept of each jukebox remains the same, they all function a bit differently. The jukebox of long-term subject in this case is the Seeburg SE100, which in the case of this project would start on the driveway in some state of greasy chaos that would end up becoming a disorganized box of parts, or what one might call biting off more than you can chew, preceded by the rest of the monster being shoved to the back of the workshop to take up much needed space for the next 2 years. But let's not be reminded of the horrors past, but rather the progress made. Because in this video, I'm going to get into a brief explanation of the mechanism function contacts and some basic troubleshooting notes. Which brings us back to about 4 years ago. At this point, most of the mechanism has been reassembled and now ready to mount back onto its track. There may be an easier method than this, but after inserting the scan rail, it is just a matter of lining the mechanism up and screwing the rail down into the carousel. Here I am now inserting the screws finger tight into the rail. Only finger tight, because once all the screws are in, I will then be tightening them down one by one. After this point, I now have to move the mechanism manually to gain access to the rest of the screw holes. Now proceed to insert the screws and turn them down finger tight once again. Once that is done, I now use a screwdriver to tighten them all down in series. The mechanism moves quite easily without the motor installed. You can either turn the record flywheel, or you can just gently pull on the mechanism and it will slide freely on its own. At this point, I was ready to start installing the various function switches. This set of contacts is part of the camshaft mode switch, which control the motor and trip circuits, located here on the service manual schematic. You can see how the contacts open and close in this clip. It is crucial that these contacts are tensioned properly so that they open and close at the right time. The next set of contacts is part of the trip reset portion of the mechanism. These contacts are normally closed unless the mechanism is in between play or scan cycles. They can be found here on the schematic and run in series with the trip solenoid. A better view of the contacts can be seen here, since it is hard to see in the video how they actually operate. You can also see when I lift the trip lever that it opens up these contacts, so that the trip solenoid can no longer operate. After the mechanism does a full cycle, they should close again. I almost forgot to bring up this part of the mechanism, and I am glad I remembered because this is also a very important component. This is the scan solenoid, which has a set of normally open contacts that when closed, operate the motor. Due to where I had the jukebox located, I was not able to get a clear shot of how these contacts operate. So I took out the box of parts for the other mechanism to show you. Upon making a selection, the solenoid will pull the contacts close, and a 2-part sprocket will latch. After the first scan, a standoff on the carousel will push the sprocket over one tooth before the mechanism starts the second scan. After returning from the second scan, the sprocket will be pushed again past the second tooth, and then the motor contacts will open, stopping the mechanism. When a selection is made, the solenoid will pull the sprocket over, closing the motor contacts, and then the scan cycle will start over again. Now I am installing the scan reverse switch. This switch is very crucial as it tells the motor when to change direction. It is important that these contacts are clean and have the right tension. And here they are located in the service manual schematic for the SE100. It is not very clear on this schematic how they actually operate, so I found a schematic from another service manual where it is a little more clear how they actually operate the motor. And as you can see here, you should be able to toggle the contacts in a snapping motion. They should tighten up and then release. These next contacts are probably not all that crucial, as they only operate the A and B side indicators for where the mechanism is positioned. These contacts are located beside the stylus mechanism. As you can see here, located on the schematic, the contacts only operate 2 lamps with a ground reference to complete the circuit to turn either the A or B lamp on, which when the mechanism stops on a record, it will tell you what selection you're actually on. Now, you may be wondering what the 2 switches on top of the mechanism are used for. Well, in short, they are there to just make your life easier. One switch will turn the motor off and change the mode of the mechanism to, I guess, the service mode, which will then allow you to use the momentary switch to run the motor wherever and whenever you like. This means that for troubleshooting, you could stop the machine in play and then trip the mechanism to see that the machine cycles properly. Another thing to note on the schematic is the location of the trip switch for when the stylus gets to the end of a record. This is a magnetic reed switch, and in the case of my mechanism, I had to replace the magnet as it was no longer strong enough to trip the reed switch to tell the mechanism when the record was done. This for me was probably one of the more minor issues I had with this mechanism, which is basically why I ended up rebuilding the entire jukebox from the ground up. Hopefully for anyone working on one of these jukeboxes, they will be a little more fortunate than me to have one that is in a little better working order and just needs some minor touch-ups. And just one last thing to note is the location of the detent timing switch, which is at the back of the mechanism behind the motor. Although I forget the exact purpose of this switch, from what I do recall, it must be set to close the contacts at each passing of a record slot to allow for the proper tormat memory readout time. This is likely one of those things that if your mechanism is picking up the right record, you probably want to just leave it alone. But in this case where the entire mechanism had been taken apart and rebuilt, it will have to be readjusted accordingly to the service manual of the jukebox that you are working on. And if you've made it this far without any horrible snags, then it is time to go to your lubrication chart and start oiling all the essential areas. And now you should be able to set up your jukebox in a place of choosing and have some fun. Because as much of a rabbit hole nightmare these old beasts can be, the end result feels very rewarding even if you end up spending more time than you bargained for coming up with a solution to an oddball problem. Now on that note, if your mechanism is endlessly cycling, you may want to check that the safety plunger at the back of the mechanism moves freely and does not bind like mine kept doing. I am happy to announce that you have made it to the end of this video. Hopefully you have found this video useful. Feel free to comment or ask questions below, but stay tuned because in the next portion of the series, I will be getting into rebuilding the amplifier of the SE100. Thanks for watching and see you next time.